Aloha mai kako. Hui aina Pili Pili is a Native Hawaiian initiative in the College of Social Sciences at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Pili Pili marks the Ili Aina, a subdivision of land where we are located on the Manoa campus. Our initiative provides a coordinated effort in the College of Social Sciences towards becoming a Hawaiian place of learning. Pili Ike Kanaka is our Indigenous Speakers series that features Native Hawaiian and Indigenous scholars, practitioners, and leaders on social science topics. Through this speaker series, we hope to build Pilina relations through the engagement of students, staff, faculty, and the community with thought-provoking social science knowledge from Indigenous perspectives.
Mahalo Kamakana for the introduction. And it's really a great pleasure to have an opportunity to introduce my friend, my hoa, Dr. Randall Akee, who I got to know back when we were both undergraduates, back in the day at Dartmouth, but really is just a phenomenal scholar and thinker, and really so glad that we can have him opening up this series for us. So let me read the official bio here and hand it over. Dr. Randall Akee, Native Hawaiian, is an associate professor in the Department of Public Policy and American Indian Studies at UCLA. Previously, he served as a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Akee completed his doctorate at Harvard in June 2006, is an applied microeconomist, and has worked in the areas of labor economics, economic development, and migration. He's conducted research on the determinants of migration and human trafficking, universal basic income programs on educational attainment, voting, and obesity, and the impact of the Earned Income Tax Credit on intergenerational mobility across race groups. He's conducted research on several American Indian reservations, Canadian First Nations, and Pacific Island nations, in addition to working in various Hawaiian communities. He spent several years working in the State Office of Hawaiian Affairs Economic Development Division, is also a research fellow at the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, and serves the University of California Office of President's Native American Advisory Council. Previously, he served on the National Advisory Council on Race, Ethnic, and Other Populations at the U.S. Census Bureau, and has worked extensively with public use and confidential use Census Bureau data in his research. He is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Randall Akee.
Aloha. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tengan and Kamakana for the introduction, and aloha mai kako. My name is Randy Akee. I'm from Waipahu, actually. Grew up there, and I'm currently in what is known as Tovangar, which the rest of us have learned is the LA Basin area. It's the traditional homelands of the Tongva people of California, and I work at UCLA. So again, I really appreciate everyone being here. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen, and I'll be showing you. I'll go through some of my slides, and I'll show a couple of examples of where data does exist for Native people. I'll show you a couple of applications of the use of that data and some of the implications, which I think are kind of interesting, and why quantitative social science research is a partner to qualitative social science and other types of research, and specifically in the context of nation building, of Indigenous peoples, building, recreation, revitalization. And I'm happy to talk more about that in depth, after in the question and answer period as well. So, sort of called this talk Counting the Uncounted, Interdisciplinary Social Sciences, Research and Insight for Indigenous Peoples. Hang on. Okay. So, maybe I don't have to educate this population, the group here, but American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders are both a racial category, but also a political group in the United States. So they occupy unique spaces in that sense. And they're unique spaces for lots of reasons, but just from practical data standpoints, they are communities that are small, but important to collect data on for all kinds of reasons. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Ultimately, however, the way you measure this population, AIAN or NHPI, it actually has an impact on the characteristics of the population. So the Census Bureau and much of these data that exists often doesn't, well, the census data does, but other data sets often don't differentiate between being American Indian, Alaska Native, or NHPI, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, alone, or in combination with other races, meaning, mixed race. And the different communities there, there's an overlap, of course, potentially, depending on how people quantify or categorize themselves, let's say. And it has different implications for what that population looks like on average. And understanding that is an important distinction that isn't often made in sort of the conventional press, and sometimes even in research. And so these kinds of characteristics matter, and having that extra piece of information actually has a big impact on analyses that are done. And the other dimension that also matters is geographic location. For American Indians, Alaska Natives, they have villages, they have reservations. For Native Hawaiians, we have Hawaiian homelands, which are specific geographies. And again, the population that resides in these homelands, as defined by federal state laws, may differ from the population that lives off or outside of those geographic locations. And distinguishing between those communities, again, matters tremendously and isn't often done in conventional popular press, and again, sometimes in research. And so these things matter for the quantification and the categorization and the discussion of these different communities. And just to give you an example, about 70% of the American Indian Alaska Native population in the US as a whole lives off of reservations. And that's, it's a bigger amount for Native Hawaiians as well. So just to show you the difficulty in collecting data or observations for these populations, these are the different race and ethnic categories along the left side here: white, Black, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander. And here are different surveys that exist, national surveys. So the first one here is the current population survey, and that gives you sort of a snapshot of economic, social conditions for the population. You see, if you wanted to study the white population, there's about 164,000 observations, essentially every single year. This is for 2007, but it looks about the same year in, year out. If you wanted to look at the Black African-American population, there's about 23,000. If you look at American Indians, there's about 27,000, almost 28,000, 2,800, I should say. For Asian, there's about 9,000. For Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, so this is the category combined, there's about 900 observations. And so that's included both in Hawaii as well as in the continental US. And so what that means is doing statistical analyses, comparisons, or looking at subgroups becomes quite difficult because that population, the sample there is quite small. The other survey that's often used is the survey of income and program participation. So this gives us information on the population that's receiving TANF or WIC or Head Start or Medicaid, Medicare, a whole bunch of programs that we care about. And you see, if you're interested in studying that for Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, well, you're kind of out of luck. Same thing for Alaska, American Indian, Alaska Natives. There just are no observations for them, because the sample sizes aren't large enough to capture any usable observations. The next survey is the National Health Interview Survey. And again, you see there's some American Indian, Alaska Native observations, but again, no Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander observations. Another survey is the Behavioral Risk Factors Social Survey, which gives us a lot of really interesting information on risky behaviors, smoking, drug use, alcohol abuse, violence. And so you can see that there are some observations for Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. Again, it's a relatively small sample. And then another data set that I think is important for people to know about is the Survey of Consumer Finance. This survey, you can see if you're anything other than white or black in the United States, there's no information for this population. And this is an incredibly important survey because this is the way in which we track wealth and assets in a community. This is the primary data set that asks those types of information. So if you wanted to know what the wealth level is, home ownership, ownership of savings accounts in a particular community, because we think this is an important measure of well-being and long-term well-being, especially intergenerationally, we don't have any information for these populations. So just entire swaths of the population, we have no idea what their asset ownership is, what their wealth is. So we do get away from that by using large data sets, and there are some data sets. There's the US Decennial Census, which most of you are probably familiar with and just occurred 2020. That happens every 10 years. And then every year, the census now conducts what's called American Community Surveys, which are a 2 to 3% sample of the whole US. And they ask some in-depth questions, some in-depth questions on employment, income, residential location, and housing type information. The drawback is that these data aren't linked over time with one another, so you can't follow the same household over time. It's just the American Community Survey anyway is just a 2 to 3% sample of the population, so you probably don't see the same household year in, year out. In fact, you're assured you don't. And often they don't ask a lot of in-depth questions, like do you smoke, for instance. And they definitely don't have a lot of extensive questions on things like assets, such as wealth. However, having said that, the census data are still the gold standard, and they're still the most useful for studying small populations like American Indian, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. So now, my hope there is to sort of give you a sort of a lay of the land of the lack of data and how we don't have a lot of observations in existing surveys, and one has to be creative in order to test hypotheses and test social programs or historical programs that affected Native or Indigenous peoples. So I'll show you three research results. And I'm happy to talk about them in depth, and then I'll conclude with some new emerging policies that are occurring in Oklahoma, which I think are very interesting for Native Hawaiians and other Indigenous peoples as well. So a lot of people have heard recently about the boarding school situation or history in Canada, given the sort of discovery of extensive burials in Kamloops in Western British Columbia, one of the communities up there. This is a piece of research that occurred in 2016, so before the recent knowledge. But if for Canadian First Nations peoples, the boarding school experience is well known in their communities. It was a tragedy and continues to be, as many of us have seen, sort of continues on as sort of the destruction that it caused sort of lives on to this day. What this research undertakes, and again in a very novel way, and so this is a map here of Canada. So this is British Columbia, and Nova Scotia is way over here, and the rest of southern, it's not including the northern territories, are located here. Shows essentially the provinces of Canada, and the light blue dots are Aboriginal settlements, First Nations communities, and the purple dots or purple flags are residential schools. And what this researcher did, her name's Donna Fair, she's a professor, she's an economist in Canada, is she used census data for Canada, and there's a question there that asks, did you attend boarding schools as a child? So she looked at the adults in the 1990s and looked at differences in various outcomes. And yeah, that's kind of what I said. There's really interesting questions in the Canadian census that we don't have in the US in terms of the kind of questions asked on the census, such as what kind of cultural activities do you practice? Normal standard stuff such as employment, receipt of welfare payments, educational attainment, that's there. And what she did was, as I said here, compared individuals who attended these schools to those who didn't. And she uses a very unique technique, which we don't need to go into, to be able to create that analysis. What she finds is really interesting results. She finds that, so these people are now full-fledged adults. They're in their 60s and 70s in the 1990s. So the boarding school experience happened in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s for this generation. And she found that for those adults who were, again, in their 60s in the 1990s, compared to those who hadn't gone to boarding school, their high school graduation rates were higher. Their receipt of government transfers, sort of, welfare type programs, payments were lower. And their probability of being employed were also higher. So, from a governmental standpoint, this is useful because it means there's less reliance on government. There's more gainful employment. She was able to, however, look at the other side of the coin because there are these cultural components. What she found was that for those same individuals who attended the boarding schools, they were less likely to live in their Aboriginal community as adults. They were less likely to participate in traditional ceremonies, and they were less likely to speak their native languages. So this kind of research, it probably happened in Australia. It probably happened in the United States. We just don't have the data in these places to measure it as well as they do in Canada. But it's informative for the other places that these types of boarding schools occurred. And so, ultimately what this means is that these forced boarding schools that happened for First Nations peoples resulted in, success in terms of employment, education, and cultural assimilation, because that was the purpose of these schools, was to assimilate Indigenous peoples into the Western mainstream society. And from a Native perspective, that's really troubling and problematic from a human perspective even. But there is sort of a takeaway that I think is quite interesting from this research for all Native peoples. Number one, these forced boarding school things are bad, clearly, but it really does inform us that education curriculum matters. And it should be seen as a reason to support culturally based education curriculum in Native Indigenous communities. It should be seen as an important component of nation building because it is what builds the generations and sort of the opposite of that, dismantles it. So I think, it's not as if there's a silver lining, but there's an important sort of nugget of information that comes out of this that I think is quite useful. And so that's the boarding school social science research. I'll show you a piece of my research that I've done with other colleagues. Again, this research is done with a bunch of psychologists and epidemiologists at Duke University. So again, very sort of interdisciplinary work. And this is a map of North Carolina, where Duke University is located. And these blue figures here are all counties in the western part of North Carolina. They're part of the Great Smoky Mountains, the Great Smoky Mountains. And in the middle here is an American Indian community. It's called the Eastern Band of Cherokee. They're sort of the remaining community, one of the remaining communities of Cherokee that weren't relocated to Oklahoma in the 1800s. And the Duke researchers conducted research on this, on all children, both American Indian and non-Indian, living in the 11 counties, starting in 1996. And I'll talk a little bit more. They followed children who were 9, 11, and 13 years old and followed them, surveyed them every single year thereafter into the current time period. So these children who in the 90s were, 9, 11, and 13 are now adults themselves in their 30s and approaching 40. And we have information on them throughout semi-annual surveys, and they have children of their own as well. So they've been continually surveyed. What happened the program that we as researchers are investigating is that a casino opened up on the reservation about halfway through the first survey wave, this first survey that was conducted in the 90s by 1996. And it operates there, and it's a form of economic development. And one thing that's unique about it is that the tribal community, the tribal government, pays a proportion of the revenues to all tribal citizens. And it's a relatively small community. It's about 8,000 people, so it's not incredibly large. And one can think about this as equivalent to a universal basic income, which is something that politicians have been talking about in recent years. And there's not a lot of evidence for the impact of universal basic income on a number of outcomes. It turns out communities like this have been pursuing a universal basic income since the mid-90s, so over 25 years. And what we do is we look at the impact of this universal basic income on children's outcomes. And so again, you should think of this as an anti-poverty program. You make people less poor, what happens to the household, what happens to the children, and we can look at the long run effects on the children as well, because as I mentioned, the children affected in the 90s are now adults themselves. And so we can compare children who received this extra income, sort of where their household incomes were bumped up over the poverty line, to the households that weren't affected, because we have non-Native Americans, we have essentially white children in and around the community who didn't receive this per capita cash payment, this universal basic income. Only tribal citizens and their children received them. And what do we find? Well, we find that by age 21, these children that were affected by the extra income and who were previously in poverty, so they're prior to the casino opening, they were the poorest of the poor. We find that their educational attainment by age 21 has increased by 1.1 years, so positive impact. We find that high school graduation by age 19 increases by 39%, sort of on-time high school graduation. We find that their voting behavior as adults increases between 10 to 20%, depending on whether you're talking about men or women. So the children themselves, when they become adults, they're more likely to vote. We also find that the children's own behavioral and emotional disorders decreased over their adolescence, because again, we are able to measure that. We also found, because there were some survey questions asked about the parents as well, that parental fighting decreased and parental drug and alcohol abuse also decreased. So, the impact of this research we think is quite important, because again, it indicates the impact of something like a universal basic income and the benefit that it can have, not just in the immediate time period, which sometimes can be quite important, paying your rent, getting money for food, gas money to take you to work or to school, but the long-term effects of it as well also are positive in most sense of the word. What it does show as well is that poverty is sort of an important obstacle for children. It may mean that they have almost a year's worth of less school if they grow up in poverty. It also means that eliminating this obstacle may have long-run benefits to individuals in terms of educational attainment and those sorts of things, but it may also have societal benefits, because these people are more likely to participate in society. And we had one measure, which is voting, for instance. So the last piece of social science research that I'll show you that I think is quite interesting and quite useful is sort of a look at how climate change and/or destruction of natural resources or animals impacts communities. So the setting for this is our bison in the United States, the continental North America, I should say. Prior to contact, the estimate is that there were 50 to 60 billion that roamed the continent. When the US and Canada were established, these animals were slaughtered for sport and to facilitate westward expansion. And there's also some evidence that it was done as a punishment towards Indigenous peoples, because it was known that they relied on this resource for their living, for food, but also other materials. And so this is research, again, joint with economists, but also anthropologists, and I'll show you how they came up with that. And this here is a old photo of bison skulls, just a mountain of the ones that were killed. What they did was they used, they tracked the original range of bison, and that's sort of this red line here. And so communities that lived there relied on, indigenous communities relied on the bison over time. The blue lines show the constriction of the bison range due to overhunting, due to the sort of pursuit of exterminating them in many locations. And so tribal nations that resided in the areas, again, between the red and this sort of greenish, bluish line, essentially had no resources or very little resources and were essentially starved or constrained. And what the researchers did here is they looked at outcomes on the impact of these populations, both in the short run and today, the same communities that remain there today. It has a long-term impact. What they found is that more than a century after the bison went extinct in these geographic areas, the tribes that relied on them still have lower incomes today, higher rates of suicide and social unrest than those that didn't. The per capita income in those communities that were, again, most affected is about $3,000 lower for the affected tribe. They also found that in the 1 to 2 generations after the extinction of the bison in their area, the average height of the population, and this is where they get a lot of really cool data from anthropologists who measured this at the time and subsequently, heights decreased between 2 to 4 inches, really suggesting a stunting effect over time because of lack of nutrition or high quality nutrition. So they're really able to show in this research that, again, the depletion of natural resources, the removal of a staple has both short-term and pretty dire short-term impact, but also long-term impact as well. Even to this day, these communities are still relatively impoverished compared to other communities. And so the last thing I'll leave you with is some new emerging activities that are going on that I don't have any research for, but I'd be happy to talk to others if they're interested in pursuing it, because I think there's some really interesting insights there. Is sort of a recent Supreme Court decision in 2020 that determined that creek lands, Muskogee Creek lands, which are this area in Oklahoma and encompass a very big city, Tulsa, Oklahoma, are now Indian lands, the reservation of the Muskogee Creek. Up until now, it had been decided that that land was no longer jurisdictionally federally recognized Indian land. The Supreme Court just last year reversed that, and it has amazing implications potentially for things such as crime, taxation, zoning. The Oklahoma state maintains that it only applies to the major crimes, which is sort of criminal jurisdiction. But from what I've heard, all legal experts know that this is false. So what that means is that on these other realms of, again, natural resource protection, fracking, taxation, zoning, housing development, governance, who gets to decide, who's in charge jurisdictionally, that's all up for grabs. And so it's an incredibly interesting time there. And I think it's quite interesting, whether Native Hawaiians are interested in federal recognition or not, I think it's still going to be quite an interesting place for us to see how self-governance occurs or doesn't occur in this community. And so just to conclude, I think social science, qualitative social science, while it's quite difficult to do because we don't have perfect data for the communities that we might be interested in, it's still possible, and it's informative for policy creation and program evaluation, evaluating the impacts of certain changes in laws, certain changes in behavior at the federal, state, local levels. The benefit of this is that some of this research can be used, in court cases, can be used to argue and advocate, at various governmental levels. So developing expertise is important in order to evaluate good or bad social science research. I haven't shown you the examples of bad social science research, but they're out there for Native peoples, and can come to some really problematic conclusions. And so having more people conducting this kind of research and becoming experts in it, quite useful, because again, there's just as much bad research as there's good research based on faulty premises and assumptions and data and definitions and categories. And there is more research being done on, by, for, and with Indigenous peoples. And so there's a bunch of us researchers out there. And so, anyone else is interested in pursuing more of this, there's something called the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. Here's the website down here. And it's a group of Indigenous peoples from the U.S., continent, Alaska, Hawaii, who talk about sort of how we promote data access, sharing, archiving, and good governance of the data. There's also an international organization, GIDA, which also, and it's a coalition from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the US, and we're trying to get some connections in South Latin America. And then the last slide. And if anybody's interested in economics and in Indigenous peoples, there's an additional group, ARIP, which welcome you all to join as well. And we have a speaker series that's virtual. And with that, I'll stop. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Mahalo nui, Randy. Wonderful, wonderful talk. Giving us so much to think about. We've got a few questions that have come up here in the chat. So let me go to the first that came a little early on from Lulu, who says Hawaiians are pushed off their homelands. How do natives reclaim their land today? And perhaps this is a question of the place of the quantitative research that you're talking about in that.
Sure. I mean, so I think that's $1 million question, and I think lots of academics and advocates and activists, we're all interested in how do we reclaim land. I think there's multiple ways. I think the role of a quantitative researcher is to be of assistance in helping to quantify questions that are of use. I think one of the things that's still ripe to know is, what are the value of the lands, that the crown lands, the ceded lands, right? What are the alternate uses of lands that are being rented, leased to governmental agencies, the federal government, the military for $1 a year, right? What are the alternate uses? How could they be used? How could they be employed for community, private, other interest? And what would that look like, right? So that sort of counterfactual estimation could still be done, hasn't been done. So there's lots of ways in which a quantitative analysis, in conjunction, in collaboration with, natural resource, scientists could work in collaboration and try to identify, right, what's the alternative use of this parcel of land or this acreage here, as opposed to being, a military base or, a telescope, right? So yeah, there's roles.
Mahalo nui. This again is a reminder, if folks have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. There are a couple from Alexandria, and I will just maybe offer the first two. If no others come up, then we can go to the second set. But the first is, why is there no data on boarding schools in the United States like there is from Canada? Do they not exist? Or was there no accurate record keeping?
Yeah, so they're piece and partial, they're piecemeal. They exist at the different schools and some archives. And so it's quite a lot of work to put them together jointly. What the researcher in Canada was able to do is, because a single question on the Canadian census just asked everybody in Canada, did you attend First Nations boarding school? So it wasn't sort of necessarily have to go to all these disaggregated boarding schools and collect information. It could be done, and it actually has been done. There's a bunch of research on boarding schools in the US done in a qualitative way, interviewing of boarding school survivors, looking at records, journals, and those sorts of things. So there is data, there is information out there. It's just not national or not easily accessible at a national level as it is in Canada, because the Canadian census asked that specific question. Our census, the US Census, doesn't ask that question. So you can't identify whether or not someone participated or was at a boarding school.
Great. And, I think I want to piggyback on that one, because in our experience, sometimes Hawaiians don't see ours as connected to the boarding school experience, but Kamehameha schools is a direct descendant of that genealogy of boarding schools. And in some ways, actually, the boarding schools started Hilo. So there's that other way that things run around. But I'm wondering if there is any data specifically for the experience of Kamehameha or even other boarding schools, even stretching back to the kingdom versus now, and if different data considerations are to be had if you're doing this kind of really historical research covering that span.
So there's definitely opportunities for data collection, data digitization, right? Sort of taking the sort of logs and the what's the word? The students' population, and sort of digitizing and creating databases of that. To some extent, there is some of that. The Census and Ancestry.com has done some of that. So there are some school logs of students at the Kamehameha schools, for instance, in Ancestry.com, right? So you get some of these, from the early 1900s, for instance. So you can get some of that information. There is some of that there in terms of students and the population. So there's a little bit of information out there. Again, it comes down to the ability to measure an outcome. Are they more likely to get married, less likely to get married, more likely to speak Hawaiian, not speak Hawaiian? Those measures don't exist really well in other data sets. So we could identify someone who attended, perhaps, but we can't measure the outcome like they could in Canada. So you see, I think this is a standard result, a standard situation that we're in, is that for this population, we just don't have the measures because they don't exist, or they don't exist in the right way. But I don't think it's necessary. It's not always necessary, let's say, to have that, because we know that the impact is probably the same. And so I think we have lots of examples of indigenous peoples around the world that have been subjected to colonialism and genocide and a whole removal and a whole bunch of other things. And I think there are ways of learning from that. If not in every single community, there are parts of it that are well documented in others. And I don't think we share those as much as we should and could, because I think they're learning opportunities, and I think they benefit us all.
Mahalo. There are a couple other questions from Alexandria, but let me circle back to them if we have some time. I want to note in the chat a note of appreciation from Carrie, and also a question from Craig. Great research. Does the increase of economic self-sufficiency lead directly to a decrease in cultural identity? From the research, please elaborate.
Well, that's something Dr. Tengan could actually talk to. That's the kind of the cultural anthropologists who work on this. What is cultural identity? And identity changes over time. It's not static. So I don't think anyone can show that. It might lead to cultural change. It might lead to different ways of governing, different ways of living and being. Does it change your culture? I don't know. So I think that's a question that I think it depends on what your definition of culture is. I think there's questions on, the kind of work that I'm interested in is well-being, right? Are people surviving to adulthood? Are people, committing suicide? Are people dying from, drug overdoses? And is it due to poverty? Is it due to being removed from your community? Is it due to being removed from the resources that you grew up with or your ancestors grew up with or something like that, right? So that to me is the important and interesting aspects of economic development. Do we see self-sufficiency restoring communities, restoring households, restoring families? If it restores culture along the way, that's also there too, right? And maybe that is part of the process, right? Maybe that's part of the restoration, is that they go hand in hand. I'm not trained to do that. That's not my expertise, the cultural aspects of it, because we all have to specialize. But I'm really interested in the well-being in the very material, physical sense. That's
Mahalo. And again, why these approaches really are best done when it's a mix of both the quantitative and the qualitative. There's ways of measuring, but then also how do you interpret that? And
we learn from each other too. And I mean, I think that's another way of thinking about it, is that we bring different things to the table, experience and insights that often, if you're just in a very siloed research environment, community, you don't think outside that those constraints, and you're not thinking of more interesting questions or ways you could influence or improve existing research.
Hi, mahalo. Okay, great. There is a question now from Kavena. Mahalo nui, Dr. Akee. You mentioned bad examples of research. What are best practices in making sure we are engaging in good research? Are there protocols you recommend when gathering and interacting with this kind of data?
Oh, that's a great question. And so the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network that I showed earlier, USIDSN, we have some principles that we've developed. So please take a look there. They're called the CARE principles and the FAIR principles. And they're about, ideas of reciprocity in data collection, access, storage, how one approaches the communities as well. Yeah, I think, there's been a lot of progress. There's been a lot of work done to at least start lining and aligning these practices, especially for the quantitative world. I think the anthropologists have gone through this a little bit earlier because they had, lots of blowback, and rightfully so in most cases, in their work. And it was seen the sort of, numbers and figures might be sort of, less impactful or less problematic, but they can be just as problematic. And so in recent years, there's been interest in this, and we've been working hard at this to recognize the importance here. So yeah, so there's a bunch of new work out there, and we're all concerned about it, and we're concerned. And so one way people are concerned about it is that there are now institutional review boards, IRBs, which universities have in order to undertake research, on human subjects. But many Native communities now are imposing that on outside researchers as well. So again, the ethical, appropriate way in going about doing this research is getting permission from a governing body. Not all communities have governing bodies. Some are, not self-governing. Some do. And so adhering by best practices is incumbent on the researcher themselves. But asking around, I think, is the way to go, and seeing what others have done.
Thanks. I think you're partly answering another question that came up from EU about asking for more elaboration on Indigenous data sovereignty and how scholars are doing it. Did you have a kind of nutshell definition of Indigenous data sovereignty, or maybe more than a nutshell?
No. So the idea is, right, who gets to access the data, who gets to archive it, who gets to define it. It's that ball of wax, right? Because everything from a traditional song to my income to the lands that my ancestors own, that can all fall under Indigenous data, right? You can interpret this very broadly, and so who gets to define that? We think it's the community that it comes from. Who gets to access it? Who gets to archive it? Those are the moving parts. we don't have all the answers because we're really just, as a community of researchers, quantitative researchers who are Indigenous themselves, starting to grapple with this. The broader community wasn't really that interested in it, right? Because it's an extra hurdle, but it's ethically, morally important. And so this is a new area. I mean, clearly, I mean, many people know sort of genomic. If you go to the Bishop Museum, you'll see the genomic studies edition there that Keolu Fox helped organize. And he's so from a very biological, you know, medical standpoint, there's those people. Then there's people like me who use, you know, tax form data and, you know, census data. And then you have other sort of, you know, again, cultural type data, right? You know, the names of the winds and the you know, the seasons, right? That's data, that's ecological data that exists as well. So you've got this entire span, and coming up with one set of rules is not going to work. And so that's what we're grappling with, and we're trying to grapple with how do we make this flexible for different types of researchers in different types of environments, in different countries and different communities. So the point is, we're just starting all of this. In the US, we're sort of behind Australia and New Zealand. They're actually sort of a couple of years ahead of us. They actually have an entire volume out on Indigenous data sovereignty. It's out by Routledge, the publisher. So you can Google, and I think you can get a free copy, like an online copy if you're at all interested. It's huge, but it's fantastic. We in the US are starting. We had our very first meeting ever at UCLA in 2017. We had plans for more meetings, and the pandemic happened. So, you know, we are hoping to hold more events in the future, but we're not there because of everything. So stay tuned, and you know, please join up. We're happy to have more participants. Absolutely.
Mahalo. That's a nice segue to the next question, but do want to also note a couple offerings from Heather on different sources in the chat. But to the question, I think that segues nicely from that last point from Max. Kia ora, Dr. Akee. Could you elaborate on life expectancy differences between Indigenous/First Nations populations in the US versus Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand? I've seen life expectancy differences quoted as 1 to 2 years less for Indigenous populations in the US, whilst it sits at between 7 to 10 years in Australia/Aotearoa. Is the US doing better, or is it to do with the quality of data, as you mentioned in your survey slide?
Yeah, great question. No, the US isn't doing better in terms of that. In fact, there's an entire movement, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, where there's a huge population that are dying at ages that are just unheard of in the general population. Some of it is because of potentially trafficking. Some of it is they're missing or they're murdered because of abuse. Some of it, the missing also means sort of high suicide rates in that sense. They're no longer around. And that's also the case in Canada. So actually, I, with a couple of colleagues, have done some work in Canada, and we're doing some work in the US on these age distributions and the missing, you know, what the counterfactual would have been if the population had grown, and these premature deaths. So the answer is, yeah, there's still high premature death among Indigenous peoples in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere. What was I going to say else about that? The other problem we get, again, is that there's also misclassification, miscategorization of Indigenous peoples. In the American Southwest, Indigenous peoples can be misclassified on death certificates as Hispanic, Mexican, and maybe they are, maybe they're not. Maybe they identified as Indigenous, you know, from a particular tribe, but the coroner or the doctor who sees them identifies them as Mexican. So there's a miscategorization. In places like Oklahoma, where the primary sort of you know, sort of community or mixing is with white, the population, they also may get tagged as white and not, you know, American Indian. So there's also these biases that exist just even in administrative data, because people aren't able to self-identify at death if their family aren't around as well. So you've got these multiple layers of complication that exist in collecting this type of data.
Hello. I think we're just about down to our last question here before we segue out. So this is coming from Cynthia. with regard to data sovereignty, what are your thoughts with regard to previous data that was collected, i.e. biospecimens, research data on tribal lands, and then taken off those lands to continue studies offsite? Does the indigenous community still have ownership of that data, although individual tribal members participate in studies off tribal lands?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of the case study and the impetus for this concern, right? Sort of the extraction of data and it being used in ways that the community didn't approve of, and being used for generations in a way that's either unethical or counter the community's desires, wishes, or agreements. So absolutely, those are the things that we hope to prevent from happening in the future with data use agreements, MOUs, and those sorts of things. So absolutely. Yeah.
Mahalo nui. There's a few other comments in the chat. An earlier question we don't need to maybe come to now, but asking of the implications of the 2020 ruling for Hawaiian movements for Aloha Aina and even Hawaiian homelands. Some other folks looking to see who you're related to.
Yeah,
like those familiar connections.
We are. Kuli'o'o. Yes. My grandpa's
And
cousin.
just other appreciations here. But yeah, on behalf of our Hui Aina Pili, our Native Hawaiian initiative, which I can't recall if it was stated up front, but when we're taking this name of Pili, it's to mark the Ili Aina that we're located in on the Manoa campus of Pili, that evokes these relations of Pilina and connection. And it's really an inspiring talk that you've given to us to connect to these histories, to connect with data and with each other in really important and new ways. So mahalo nui, Randy, for being a part of this.
Please be in touch. Yeah, please be in touch. I'm happy to chat with anybody.
And Kamakana, I'll bring you back in for our final closing here.
Yes, so mahalo to Dr. Akee for taking time to join us today, Dr. Tengan for moderating. Mahalo everyone for attending today's session. We hope you all receive some thought-provoking aha moments during the presentation and the Q&A session. It was really good discussions. Again, this presentation is recorded and will be publicly available. And also be sure to check your email for our next month's speaker. Mahalo and aloha, and this concludes our session.
Aloha, hui hou.